which would also result in some kind of collaboration, things like that. So we see the beginnings of that. And maybe in the future, the privatization of the ordinance, because this government, like any other government we have had in the last 20-25 years, it's so keen on privatizing any other public assets. So it may move in that direction also, where they privatize ordinance factories. That can emerge. We already have 2 very big industrial houses already involved in it, and big time entry of other big corporate houses with Reliance, Larsen and Toubro. Piparav is another private company which is involved in defense sector. Tatas are already interested in it, etc., etc. So the big corporate houses in India are suddenly, with this opening up and the kind of domestic market that would be available to them, a captive market supplying to the Indian forces, would create the kind of military industrial complex, and with Israel's involvement, I mean, that's a very, very critical factor. I think encouraging Israel to set up its armament units in India to produce a much larger quantity than what they're able to do because of various other factors in Israel, the scale of production, etc., etc. There is a strong likelihood of Israel and India, that kind of a strategic alliance, which would be the way in which would establish a military industrial complex, create the kind of vested interest that you're talking about, which would generate its own interest. But what about Indian Army's reluctance to move out of, say, Assam or Jammu and Kashmir? What is that? Is it economic interest, particularly military? Power and pelf. Please understand that the Indian Army, having moved into a territory, and this is also a tradition of most armies, colonial or post-colonial, which is when they feel that they have shed blood for a territory, they don't want to retreat from that. It's there. They won it. Kashmir is something Indian Army believes it has won. It's a fruit of war. Indians treat Kashmir as a fruit of war. Look at the way in which the Indian tourists behave, and look at the way Indian soldiers behave, and look at the empathy between the two against the Kashmiri local Muslims, and you know what is happening there. We can't be oblivious of these realities. We can't talk about equality and democracy and secularism where we see the state is implicated in creating communalism, generating communalism, promoting communalism. Gujarat is one kind of phenomenon. Kashmir is another, and its impact is far greater. At times I believe that we don't even realize what it means. As you pointed out, with an officer cadre corps which has shrunk, they are unable to attract more, which means that they have to reduce the qualification levels to encourage more people to join in, and increase their wages to make it more attractive, remunerate, the compensation packages have to be very attractive, etc., etc. Or and carry on with the war, which has created problem of demotivation. It has created problem of discipline. It corrupts. The kind of corruption that has come up. We have all kind of corrupt actions where senior general army chiefs have been implicated, including in that famous Mumbai, that building where 2 army chiefs, one rear admiral, air force chief, acquired a house in a building which was supposed to be meant for the martyrs of Kargil. None of them were martyrs. All of them are bloody well alive, yeah. None of soldiers got that house. So the level of corruption that is seeped in. And it's bound to be there because it's so easy. This is one area which comes under scrutiny or under audit scrutiny much less. Or there is lesser control of Auditor General of India, control and Auditor General of India than in other civilian areas. So it creates, we are talking about a huge, a situation that bodes ill for us. Now, from this we may feel very pessimistic about the future and very, very troubled by what can happen and what cannot happen. So I'll just like to end on a much more encouraging note than leaving you feel very, very pessimistic. The interesting thing about India that has also happened in the last 16 years must also be kept in mind. One of them is that there has been, in the 67 years, because of all the efforts that have been made by various struggles over the last 67 years, it has contributed to democratizing the society. Not the state. The capacity of the Indian state to unleash repression is unprecedented. Its heartlessness is something we all know. Its capacity to carry on for years together a brutal war against our own people in one corner, where people are not even aware of what is going on. But at the same time, all that has happened. But just as, we may feel helpless, that we are able to do nothing for the Gaza's victims, right? We may feel completely helpless, and it may fill us with a sense of hopelessness and pessimism. But the other side of the picture is also very remarkable, that it hasn't stopped people from resistance, that they are not giving up. That is the remarkable story that remains to be told. That how is it that despite all the obstacles that have been placed against the POSCO movement, for instance, you pick up any movement that is going on in India, and you look at it, it's not as if they've finished or they've died. They're facing a new form of challenge and they're trying to confront it and overcome it. But it's not as if resistance has died. And in fact, the awareness and the degree of awareness and the kind of serious challenges that it faces and the openness to discuss some of these issues is relatively much better than what it was 10 years back. So it's not as if everything is hopeless. Yes, please.
Is there more space for questions?
No, please. You have anything?
So, you said reflections on India. Could you also actually since you came to society, what is your assessment of sort of so-called Indian society? If in a political configuration, one entity within that political configuration is just brutally being massacred, then is it even logical to think of this as a cohesive society? Because if what was being done in say Chhattisgarh or Kashmir, if that same thing was done in Delhi, and more murders happen in Delhi than Manipur, right? It's probably a more dangerous place for common people. But we can't see the kind of reaction that you get from in Delhi when you have, which is more brutal, right? That's another separate problem. But so does it even make sense to talk of Indian society? Is there even something like that? That is there a morality? Is there a conscience that this thing has? Does this thing even exist?
That's a very tricky question you posed, and at one level I would say, of course there is. As a political entity, it exists. Its laws exist. Those laws get imposed. Our reaction, our responses, our struggles are all in response to this political entity which is India. So in that sense, to deny the existence of Indian society, so to say, would not be completely accurate. But you have raised a very serious issue, that what happens? What kind of an Indian society is it that carries out massacres in one place or another and delegitimizes struggle and takes away the constitutional freedoms? How much are they part of Indian society then? And what do the other part or segments of Indian society have to say about this part of theirs which is being exposed to armed conflict and war? This is in fact the question that I'm trying to pose. There are different ways in which we address these issues. When I raise the issue of civil liberties and legal immunity, my attempt was to reach out to a much broader audience to remind them that that the constitutional, I mean, for the sake of argument, if we say the Indian Constitution is very good, that it provides certain basic freedoms and protections, then we are compelled to ask that how is it that same Indian Constitution and its laws or its principles do not get applied in an armed conflict situation, and why are we oblivious of it? It is because, and I think that's where I'm saying that we have to therefore talk about war, because by talking about